We're in a scenario where the EFF went backwards. We're in a scenario where the IFP had some growth. We're in a scenario where Panyaza Lesufi cannot form a Gauteng government without the DA, the MK, or the EFF. Trust the polls. I think this is a victory for polling.
Yep.
But what we started seeing in by-elections after the 2021 local government elections was they're often, particularly in rural areas, similar to the local government elections or higher. So that shows to me that it's a good indicator of what's happening.
Welcome to the State of the Nation. As you know, we have been following the general election very, very closely, as all South Africans have. We've interviewed just about everybody that's had a say in the election. And a lot of this has been brought to us, Pace Car Rental. They've been the people that have sponsored us, kept us on air. And we thank them so much for that. And we hope that you, Mr. Subscriber to State of the Nation, if you haven't done that, go do that now, are supporting Pace Car Rental to keep us on the air. But let's get back to the topic at hand, and that is that we followed the general election closely, and it didn't matter who you are and how close you got your predictions right. The elections threw up quite a few surprises, and the person who monitored probably closer than anybody else was Wayne Sussman. Great job on the elections.
Thank you, Mike, and I'm looking forward to this post-mortem.
Yeah, you definitely covered some ground. I don't think it was... You've had a few microphones shoved in your face, haven't you?
Yes, and a few bouquets of flowers and one or two bricks, but it's been a fun ride, a great ride.
Well, I hope somebody brought the flowers. But anyway, Wayne, well done on comprehensive coverage, but it's still not over. I mean, this is like the gift that keeps on giving. This is going to be an election that drags on, the repercussions of which are going to drag on for a very, very long time. If we can go back to post-election day, what do you make of the outcome of the elections? How much was it in line with your thinking? Give me your synopsis of the election.
Yeah, so I came into the post-election day with three competing ideas. The one is the opinion polls, and I was involved in the ENCA mark data poll, which was extremely accurate.
Yeah.
The second one, which you and I have spoken about a lot, is by-election data and whether those trends held. And those trends, there were four major trends to emerge from by-elections since 2021 to 2024. Three of those major trends held. And then my gut feel, my anecdote of watching past elections. And what I've learnt in a big way is trust the polls. I think this is a victory for polling.
Yep.
A lot of the past fundamentals which you've seen in elections, the ANC closing strong, just did not hold as much this time round. And the second thing is that by-elections were closer than my gut feel as well. So I think this is also a vindication for by-elections.
Yeah, maybe it's a vindication of polls and by-elections, but actually it's telling you more about your gut, right, by the sounds of things, because that was the wrong one of the three, isn't it?
Correct. And again, we know that there's a term in politics which the ANC's mastered, which is called the squeeze, where in the last month of a campaign, they throw everything at it, and whatever growth the DA or the EFF might have traditionally been smelling, or the IFP, a lot of that gets extinguished and evaporated. That did not happen this time. There was also the curious case of Mkhonto weSizwe, which, the ENCA mark data poll, I think, said they'd get 14%, which they did. They got spot on. I remember when the results of KwaZulu-Natal came out, which was about 45, 46%, people were saying this is simply impossible. That result held. So this is absolutely fascinating. And also, the ANC support did hold firm in some parts of the country, but in particularly the more populated parts of the country, the ANC lost tremendous ground in Gauteng, KwaZulu-Natal, and the Western Cape. And also some wild results like in Mpumalanga, which is absolutely fascinating. The ANC falling over 20 percentage points there. This is the reason why they find themselves under 40% of the vote today.
Okay, so let's start off with the polling companies. And you were involved. I actually appeared on JJ Tabani's show on television that Truth to Power, where he vehemently, that Mark Data poll was done, the ENCA had a hand in commissioning that poll, if I'm not mistaken. And the point of his show was to say, surely these numbers are nonsense. And I said, look, I believe in the process. And I had some nervous moments as we waited for it to come out, because I did absolutely endorse what the polls were saying, everything except Ipsos, who always seemed to get it wrong. But the other polls, what is it that they were doing that got it so close to right?
Yeah, well, I think what really, and polling companies are important. We just had a major election in India where the polling companies there did not get it right. So I think in South Africa, we have to give credit where credit's due. The people at Mark Data, the people at Victory Research, Brenthurst, Ipsos, all the polling companies, I think, can hold their heads high today. So first of all, what we did in our poll was face-to-face interviews. This is the NCA Mark Data again, and one of the reasons is we believe by face-to-face interviews, you are able to get people to speak more honestly and openly. They trust you more. Historically, by the way, in KwaZulu-Natal, there has been, we can call it a lie factor, because I think maybe for good reason, that people just simply don't trust pollsters, and we know it's a volatile province. So I think that's important, that you sit down and it's not just about who you're going to vote for, really understand what the way people are viewing the country and the future of the country. And I want to give credit to Victory Research, where I think, and there was a Social Research Foundation, were those daily polls. And again, they were very, very accurate towards the end. There was the DA were very high at one particular time. They came down. I think that was really helpful. So people, I think, continue to dismiss their polls, but they're really accurate. And I think this, by the way, is one of the reasons why there was such great public interest in this election, because of the amount of polls and the fact that they were very accurate towards the end.
Okay, so now let's move to the election itself, because, and we'll get to the by-elections, because there's a sort of the next episode already in the saga, which is by-elections, both before the elections and subsequently. But let's talk about the elections itself. You already alluded to the big, the big hits, some of the big hits that the ANC took. What was most surprising to you? The ANC's decline, MK's rise. What was the most significant thing to you?
Yeah, it was. We saw the court case with MK, where they made the decision that Zuma's name could not be on the ballot. And then there was the issue of Jabulani Kumalo. Normally, universally, if the political party had to endure two sucker punches like that, one would expect it would hurt them at the poll. I mean, I was wondering, and look, the polls are suggesting that the MK was doing very well, how they'd get to the finish line, whether they'd have a get out the vote operation on election day. And they just did incredibly well. Look, the polls were right about KwaZulu-Natal. They did fantastically in the Garsabande district of KwaZulu-Natal, of Mpumalanga, a large Zulu-speaking area, right on the KwaZulu-Natal border. In many Gauteng areas, we take the East Rand, Ekurhuleni, the city of Johannesburg, Lesedi, where Heidelberg is. MK did brilliantly there. And the fact that it wasn't even close in the end between them and the EFF, for me, has to be a major takeaway. What was really interesting for me is the way the ANC declined in the Western Cape. If there was one province where I think they expected to grow, it would have been in the Western Cape. And they lost essentially about 33% of their support, about 9-10 percentage points. It was a significant decline. Across the board in Gauteng, I think they lost 17 percentage points. There was a lot of Ramaphoria in 2019. That was largely extinguished by Umkhonto Sizwe, but you also see the DA growing in 8 out of the 9 municipalities. You see other parties, Action SA, even though they didn't do so well, still affecting the ANC, the Patriotic Alliance affecting the ANC. So this was an incredibly difficult election for the ANC. However, what was good for them? Limpopo. Mike, you look at the Vembe district, that's a northern part of the Limpopo, right by the Zimbabwe border. And yes, they'll be upset that in Thulamela they fell from 91% to 89%. But in all of those municipalities, it's like 2-3 percentage points dropped, over 80% mark. The Eastern Cape, I think, largely held, bar for the urban areas for the ANC. And the northwest, they're also quite resolute there. We know that this is a province where the EFF has done well in. That's about all the ANC has to show for itself in this election. It was a very disappointing election for them.
Yeah, their vote now seems to be the areas that they seem to be holding support, seem to be areas that are less economically significant and perhaps more reliant on government grants, etc. So they seem to be holding all the provinces where the economy is doing poorly.
Yeah, the one outlier is the Bojanala district, which is that part of Rustenburg and Brits, where their support was quite resolute. They didn't lose. Look, the by-election trends predicted that, by the way. But yeah, that's correct. And by the way, a lot of former homeland areas is where the ANC are incredibly strong today. And they'll have to do it. I always say, Mike, I've said on the show, I believe that political parties have the individuals, the agency, the belief, the plan. You can turn most situations around. Let's see what the ANC is going to do now.
Yeah, because they starting as somebody that watches these things, you can now almost completely give them the tag of being a rural poor party, right? So obviously it's their largesse that keeps the vote for them. It's maybe the legacy, the history. One could point to education, but they seem to be holding only areas that are completely removed from economic activity that they seem to be holding.
They lost significant ground in in all the Gauteng metros. In Tshwane, they lost a lot of ground, but it wasn't as pronounced as Johannesburg and Ekurhuleni, because it was off a lower base. It was always their weakest metro of the three. But there, the simple reason is MK wasn't such a factor in Tshwane. But you raise a very important thing here. Remember, in 2021, the ANC only got 50% in two metros. Over 50%, that was Mangaung and Bloemfontein and Buffalo City. I think it's just Buffalo City today where their support somewhat held. In all other urban areas, also the industrial heartland of the country, the ANC suffering major setbacks. And KwaZulu-Natal, because of MK and IFP, by the way, was a real bloodbath. You see that the ANC moves from the first to the third biggest party in eThekwini. eThekwini in Durban was one of the places where they did relatively well in 2019. That has all collapsed. In many of those parts of KwaZulu-Natal, there's a 40 percentage point drop or a 35 to 40 percentage point drop. It's absolutely devastating for the ANC there.
Yeah, well, the one could get very, very concerned. And yeah, we're talking politics, and that's not what, you're a politics watcher as opposed to, somebody doing something like what I do, where I can just talk and invent stuff. But, one gets a little bit concerned because if the ANC, if they really wanted to protect their vote, they would make the country poor, because that's quite clearly a way that they keep their support is the more dependent, it's the Robert Mugabe principle. You trash the economy, but then that keeps you popular because people who are economically active leave the country, or they leave politics at very least. And you become a rural poor party. We've seen that in Malawi, you see that in Zambia, you see that in other African countries. And I think that's a big trend that nobody's talking about.
Yeah, but again, I don't know, that didn't help the ANC in this election.
It didn't help them, but what I'm saying is that where you see support only out of those kind of communities, then try and turn more communities into those communities. Don't try and make metros prosperous, try and make them Buffalo City. Right, try and destroy the economy, because with economic growth comes a lack of political power. But that's a whole different discussion. I'm saying, to me, that trend is locked in. We're seeing a lot of voting trends, but certainly one of the trends that's absolute now is that you can really put the big glowing. If people want to say the DA is the party of white business, then ANC is the party of rural poor. Yeah.
So, I mean, just two data points in that. In Mfuleni, which is considered, it's the largest municipality in South Africa, which isn't a metro. There have been, even the most dyed-in-the-wool ANC supporter would say it hasn't gone well there. The ANC lost 20 percentage points. They went from 61% to 41% there. Lesedi in Heidelberg, the ANC lost more than 20 percentage points there. This is devastating. I mean, so I think people are saying, South African voters are saying, if you don't govern our areas well, we can move our vote elsewhere. And you saw this in this election.
Yeah.
So look, those rural areas remain key for the ANC, but South Africans sent a very strong message to the ANC in this election.
Okay, South Africa sent a few other messages as well, right? Obviously, MK, I don't even know if you can add anything to the MK story other than it looks like a response to Zulu tribalism, the raw appeal of Jacob Zuma. It's certainly not based on their politics and policies, which are non-existent, certainly at the time of the election.
Yeah, look, the IFP is our benchmark in a way on Zulu identity politics. And what we saw in the Gertsebande district of Mpumalanga, that's places like Secunda, places like Makondo, which is formerly Pitritif, places like Standerton, Lekwa, is quite stunning. So yes, there was this, for KwaZulu-Natal voters, Zuma was certainly more popular than any other choices. But the fact that they made such inroads in the townships of Gauteng, the Mpumalanga, and even parts of the Free State, like a little town like Fredo, the Phumelela municipality. I looked that up before I came on air. I didn't know. I always like learning new things. Majority Zulu speaking in that Free State town. So where Zulu voters just decided that Zuma represented them much more. But what was fascinating is that the IFP, and I don't want to jump ahead here, were able to grow in some of these areas. We knew they did well in by-elections before, but you're seeing them grow in the southern parts of KwaZulu-Natal. That's what makes the KwaZulu-Natal election story even more curious. You have MK coming out of nowhere, almost aligning itself with where the opinion polls had it, and then the IFP growing in areas where they shouldn't be growing in. So KwaZulu-Natal politics is funky, and it's going to be very interesting to observe for the next few years.
And one's got to say, doing what you do, you probably wouldn't want to do this in any other country in the world because this is just so interesting. But I think what MK is if we can put the tag of rural poor party to the ANC and, to a degree, MK is almost a plebiscite on Zuma's popularity. It is a bit what we start seeing voting trends, and we'll really get onto it now in the by-election, is the intersection between identity politics, I'm Zulu, or common sense, maybe IFP, Zulu enough, and maybe they'll be better for business. We'll dive into that in a second. Another party that really surprised many watchers and many analysts was EFF in many cases. JJ Tabani, for example, when he got me on air and when he was sitting here at the State of the Nation, was resolute in believing that the EFF was going to replace the DA as the official opposition. Certainly, a lot of the black middle class has invested heavily emotionally in the EFF. I find that quite striking that the people with the most to lose want to vote for Venezuela. But Venezuelans did it, so that shouldn't surprise me. But the EFF, now second election in a row, made a backward step, but this time a significant one.
Yeah, the EFF, remember just in comparing to 2019, they were the big winners, 6% to 11%. Yeah. They go backwards in this election.
And they went backwards in 21, but marginally.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So basically, what should really worry the EFF, I mean, KwaZulu-Natal was a bloodbath. And again, by-election trends predicted this, that there wasn't a decline in support, a collapse in support. And we can trace that back. And this is key when we consider the Government of National Unity negotiations, is the day the EFF turned its back on the IFP was the day its support. And you can go fact check that. their support starts collapsing in KwaZulu-Natal, and then MK comes around. So it's another tsunami. But what should also, so that's where they grew a lot in 2019. But we also remember that the three key provinces to the EFF's growth in 2014 and subsequent years was Limpopo, that's where Malema comes from, the Northwest, Marikana, and Gauteng, where's the base of the EFF party. In all three of those provinces, they go backwards, maybe flatlining in Gauteng, but they did go a bit backwards in Gauteng. That's not a good outcome. So what are the positives for the EFF in this election? Because there are, in that, and again, I want to repeat that. If you're growing tremendously in KwaZulu-Natal and all of that support just comes crashing down, it's clear that it's going to be very hard to rise. If you're not growing in Limpopo in the Northwest, it's very hard to see how you're going to rise. So some positives for the EFF. Spoke about Buffalo City earlier. That was a metro where they grew. The Eastern Cape, in some of the more rural parts of the Eastern Cape, they were able to grow. I think they grew by about 2-3 percentage points in the Eastern Cape. Fascinating was, look, there are not many voters, but in Sol Plaatje and Kimberley, they really grew. I think they grew by 50% from where they were. They grew by 5 percentage points. Places like Kuruman, which is a lot of mining, Gassegonyana municipality. So they're growing there. In Mangaung and Bloemfontein, they're growing. What's interesting, in a by-election trend showed this, is Nkomazi, which is really ANC heartland. That's a part of Mpumalanga, which borders Mozambique and Eswatini, if I have my geography 100% correct. That is where they grew. But other than that, it's a very disappointing result for the EFF. They would have wanted to do much better. Parts of Cape Town they grew, but they'll have to do a lot of soul searching.
Yeah, certainly any other party, any other organization, we'd be talking about how long the leader could last with consecutive setbacks. But that's for the EFF membership to decide. One looks at the DA. There was a lot of negative focus on the DA. They had to fight the media. They had to fight many splinter parties. And they stuck to a tactic of going back into the lager by the looks of things. And I took a lot of criticism from the DA for saying that. But they did seem to recoup the votes that they lost to the Freedom Front Plus in the 2019 election. Is that all that happened with the DA?
Yeah, so it's a very important thing you raise here. The ANC's clear competitor was Umkhonto weSizwe here. EFF also affected by Umkhonto weSizwe. ANC also affected by PA. So who was trying to steal the DA's lunch? The one who was mostly successful, but not universally, was Gayton McKenzie and the Patriotic Alliance. You can see that clearly, and that will worry the DA in certain municipalities in the Western Cape and Eastern Cape and Northern Cape in the 2026 elections. But then you have, and you see this, it's quite fascinating, Rise Mzansi, Action SA and Build One South Africa were also, and the Freedom Front, of course, the DA to be concerned about. So it's true, the DA do win. You look at the Northwest, the DA do win back Freedom Front Plus voters there. But again, and it's very important to drill down, Mike, interesting result in Gauteng. The DA growing in 8 out of the 9 metropolitan municipalities. That includes Tshwane and Ekurhuleni. The only one where they go backwards is Johannesburg. Now, I think you had Rise Mzansi in some of the suburbs, Action SA, who didn't have a good election, but holding on to some of the DA voters who voted for it in 2021. You had Bossa and you had Patriotic Alliance in some of the coloured areas. But the DA will have to ask itself, if they were able to grow in Tshwane, Ekurhuleni, Mogale City, what is the DA has a Johannesburg problem, which they need to sort out now between now and 2026. In places like Nelson Mandela Bay, you see the Patriotic Alliance affect the DA. The DA's support in the Western Cape was quite remarkable. You see places like Saldanha Bay and Worcester area where the PA really affected the DA. But the DA essentially holding its own in the city of Cape Town, growing tremendously in places like Mossel Bay and Hermanus. These were good results. And then some very interesting results. The star province for the DA, Mike, is the Free State, where they grew by about, I think 5 percentage points in the Free State. And one of the reasons for this is, yes, Freedom Front voters, but I found 3 municipalities where the DA did really well amongst black voters in this election compared to previous results. The one is the Maluti Opafong, which is Putati Jaba, we know one of the worst municipalities in the country. And I, on television, criticized the DA for closing out their campaign there. I had egg on my face because I think they're now the second largest party there. Also, Mfuleni, Thunderbale Park, just spoke about it earlier. Next to Midvaal, the DA stronghold. The DA does well there. And finally, a real odd one which I came, Tembisile Hani, which is a very important result. We spoke about homelands earlier. That's a homeland. That's a Kwaggafontein area, which is near Sekakuni land in Limpopo and in Mpumalanga. The DA grew by 50, their vote grew by 50% there. So that is interesting. So there are things for the DA to be positive about. But, I mean, if you look at those Western Cape numbers, great result, but could they replicate it again in 2026? We don't know.
Well, yeah, the DA's Johannesburg problem, as I see it, is that they've gone from having strong leadership face for Johannesburg to no leadership face compared to all the other metros and all the other big regions. You know, Western Cape, you've got a lot of personalities that have that advantage of incumbency. You've got somebody like Papas in KZN, Roy Jankelson in Free State that seems to have some kind of profile. You know, what's the best that the DA has to offer? Certainly Solium Samanga in Gauteng and nobody in Johannesburg. Yeah. You know, and that seems to be a direct issue there. But let's talk about, when we talk about the DA, you mentioned growth in certain, call them non-white areas. Do you think the road is open for them to significantly make gains in those areas, or are they just sort of swapping votes with some of their contemporaries?
Well, those are fascinating. And again, parties must go study these results. What did they do right in these areas? So I think the DA in the Free State have consistently surprised many. They must be doing something right in the DA in the Free State. The sad thing for the DA is that it's the second least populated province. But there must be. I mean, they've got to go understand these results and also then deal with the fact that, like, in a province like the Northern Cape, by the way, I think the DA got percentage-wise more votes in the Free State than the Northern Cape. And, you know, for many years they've thought that they could win the Northern Cape. They went backwards there. Why the Patriotic Alliance? So that is something they need to work on.
Let's talk about the Patriotic Alliance. They did well. They are upbeat, and quite rightly so, because, you know, I think what people miss is that this is their third election that they've actually contested. The first two, they were a non-issue, didn't get close to a seat, and now they've walked away with a couple of seats, and they certainly have tapped into a market. The question is, what market have they tapped into? I mean, we know that Gayton McKenzie took aim at the DA, and he can't finish a sentence without mentioning Helen Zille. But did he actually hurt the DA, or did he take the coloured vote that still voted for the ANC and claim that vote?
There wasn't like a tsunami. So let me give you an example in Saldanha Bay, where there was the Jocelyn Smith, that tragic story. I think the PA got 19% of the vote. They won 9. A remarkable result. They hurt the DA there, but who did they hurt most? The ANC. In George, they got 16% of the vote. The DA actually grew in George. I didn't expect them to do that. That's the third most populous municipality in the Western Cape. The PA really hurt the ANC there. But in the Northern Cape, you see the PA hurting both the ANC and the DA in that Sarah Bartman area and in Nelson Mandela Bay, which is going to be crucial in 2026. You see the PA hurting the DA and the ANC, but actually the PA hurts the ANC more than the DA in this election.
Right. So now, Wayne, we're going to get on to, I suppose we've got to end off with looking at the election and look at, I've always thought that it's sad for those parties that you can't mention them without mentioning them together. You know, Action SA, Build One South Africa, Rise. It's hard to see where the one ends and the other one starts. Sadly for them. But what is the message that they should be getting?
Well, Action SA, this was a tough election for them. I mean, this was the party which everyone is speaking about in 2021, certainly in Johannesburg. Credit was given that they ran a very disciplined campaign in 2021, only focusing on 4 metros and 6 municipalities. This was, I mean, they were at 5, 6 seats. It's not a look. They beat Rise Mzansi, which got a lot of media adoration, and they beat Build One South Africa. But I mean, if one reflects back on 2021, even the most dyed-in-the-wool Action SA supporter would say that this is not a great result. And the key will be the time between now and the local government elections, the fact that Herman Mashaba and Michael Beaumont will not be in Parliament. Athol Trollip will, of course, lead them in Parliament. This is going to be key. Look, Action SA were affected by Rise Mzansi and Build One South Africa. But I mean, Rise Mzansi, where so many social media celebrities endorsed them, to end up just ahead of Musi Maimane, I think is in a way a feather in the cap of Musi Maimane. Yeah. But how do you grow a party? I mean, this is going to be key, and I love being proved wrong, Mike. 2 MPs, 1 MPL. These are, again, competent people who will be represented in the parliament and in the legislature in Gauteng. But it's going to be key for them to stand out in a very competitive space.
Yeah, I think what it is saying is rather run your campaign on positive messaging rather than negative messaging. Much of, and I've had many of the Action SA people on the show, Rise Mzansi, Build One South Africa, DA, etc. And certainly the messaging from those parties that do have roots in many cases to the DA, or certainly in the similar ideological space, spent a hell of a lot of time not talking about their own party, but talking about the problems with the DA. And I'm not sure that South Africans are interested in that anymore. So, Wayne, we need to talk about the topic where you get very excited, and you're the master and the king and the minister of by-elections, and I follow you closely in by-elections, and we certainly agree and have a lot of offline conversations about what by-elections are telling us. South Africa, to many people that are watching this, what Wayne and I see in by-elections is that this is kind of the ultimate poll, right? You're literally forcing people out of their nice, cozy lounges to vote for the people going to represent them at local level. And often it starts telling you a picture. And much of your informed analysis about the election came from what you saw leading into the election. The elections happened at the end of May, and we did have by-elections a couple of weeks later, which were, to my mind, very interesting, right? And that was that in some of those areas where Nkonto Wesizwe has just done really well in KZN, I think there were 6 wards that contested by-elections. They win 1. There's been a dramatic sort of performance by the IFP. EFF continued to not feature at all. ANC continued to get whacked. Am I getting it wrong?
So, Mike, if I may, I just want to talk about those 4 mega trends we saw. The first one was that the ANC was in deep trouble amongst black voters in Gauteng. That played itself out on election day in Gauteng. The second one was there was chaos in KwaZulu-Natal. That played itself out on election day. The third one, we said the Eastern Cape, Limpopo, and that Bojanala district in the northwest holds firm for the ANC. These are by-election trends. Played itself out on election day. The fourth one was that there was Western Cape wobbles for the DA. It didn't really play out. The wobbles were more for the ANC. So I just want to mention that as a vindication for by-elections. So the first by-election since there was a small by-election in the ANC stronghold in Limpopo, and there they grew. And that again was a continuation of what we saw a few weeks before that in election. By the way, that turnout, it was like 10 days, 2 weeks after the election. That turnout was quite high in that by-election. But let's now deal with this massive round of by-elections.
Sorry, before we get into that, can you just explain the importance of turnout in by-elections? Because that's a thing, isn't it?
Correct, because if very few people turn out, then it's not really reflective. But what we started seeing in by-elections after the 2021 local government elections was they're often, particularly in rural areas, similar to the local government elections or higher. So that shows to me that it's a good indicator of what's happening on the ground. So we had 18 by-elections on one day, on the 20, I think it was about the 22nd of June, around about there. And what this told us was, Mike, that firstly, 12 of those in KwaZulu-Natal, 6 were in the Western Cape. 6 of those, half in KwaZulu-Natal, were Mzumbe. Now, where is Mzumbe? It's the Mtwalumi area in the south coast of KwaZulu-Natal, just below the Scottsboro-Mdoni area. It's an ANC heartland. This is where Becky Cele comes from. It's where the ANC leader Sponiso Duma comes from. What I wanted to analyze was what happened in 2021, but also happened a few weeks ago on the provincial ballot in these wards. And in 5 of those 6 wards, Umkhonto we Sizwe were the leading party. In some of the wards, it was quite close, but in some of the wards, they were well ahead of the chasing pack. And in one of those, the IFP was the biggest party on the national election day in those wards. Okay. So what we saw happen was that the IFP won 3 of those 6 wards. It's a remarkable result because this is a part of KwaZulu-Natal where the IFP were traditionally weakened. You saw the ANC hold 2 and MK beating the IFP by 17 votes in 1. Now, what is this telling us? Now, for me, is it because Zuma's name or blank picture, because it wasn't on the ballot, and people are saying that these are the same ward councillors who've been not representing our communities well? Why must you go out and vote for them? But this is deeply concerning for the MK, because just a few weeks before that, the majority of people in these wards put their trust and faith in the MK party. What we also saw, so that's Mzumbe in the south coast. You saw the ANC hold firm in Umzimkhulu, which is near the Eastern Cape. That's the ANC's real stronghold, the Harry Gwala district. You saw the IFP win another ward, by the way, in they won another ward in the Umvoti area where they took out a local party called the ABC. The MK wasn't on the ballot there. You saw the DA win a very close ward in Newcastle, an area where they had a black ward council. I think it's a candidate, which I think is important for them. Again, we spoke about areas where they grew amongst black voters. The poll was low there. And then you saw IFP also win wards, so the retained wards in Nongoma and Pongola. And then there's an area of the KwaZulu-Natal, Mike, called Mtonjaneni, where Malmouth is. And since 2021, the IFP, I think, have now won 3 or 4 wards of the ANC. They won another ward of the ANC there. So you're seeing the IFP. And again, I said some of the results of the IFP in the national elections are strange. Just continue with tremendous momentum. Can they keep this going? Because if they can keep it going, they're going to have a great 2026.
Because 2026 beckons. Another big area for voting was in the Western Cape. Let's talk about the southern, well, I suppose the eastern part of the Western Cape, right? The George area. There were quite a few by-elections in that area.
Yeah, Beaufort West. So Beaufort West is interesting. Beaufort West is it's had 4 PA mayors since 2021. And by the way, historically, since I've started following this stuff, I can't recall when last a party had an outright majority. I'm sure some smart person watching will point this out to me. But Beaufort West has been highly competitive. Traditionally, the ANC has been somewhat stronger because of a guy called Truman Prince. And we had 3 by-elections, and the DA won all 3 wards. They took 2 wards of the Patriotic Alliance and 1 ward of the ANC. The DA now have an outright majority in Beaufort West, which, look, in the grand scheme of things, even though I love Beaufort West, if you love your lamb chops, you certainly love Beaufort West. It's also where Chris Barnard comes from. But there are not many voters in Beaufort West. But the fact that the DA have an outright majority there now, I think is very, very important for them. And again, we saw this trend emerge where the DA is actually the largest party, again, on the provincial ballot and the national ballot in Beaufort West. But not in Murraysburg, where they won the 1 ward of the ANC. So this is a lot of momentum. And also there were 3 by-elections in Cape Town, admittedly all in DA strongholds. But within those by-elections. There's an area called Fasanta Kraal, one of the voting districts, which is a majority black informal settlement, admittedly very small. And there the DA, I think, won over 30% of the vote. And so it's like small results like those, which if the DA can replicate in those other areas, they can certainly turn their fortunes around. But again, the DA, look, they didn't have much competition in the city of Cape Town, but there was just a continuation of this trend, and they want to keep that going in 2026 to 2026. So it's a great day for the DA in the Western Cape and a great day for the IFP. KwaZulu-Natal, a confusing day for Mkhonto Sizwe.
And the ANC?
It was a difficult day for the ANC. They weren't able to do what they did in that first Limpopo by-election. Look, by the way, Mike, if you drill down deep, you do see some MK support coming back to the ANC. So the ANC are losing those wards. It's not a great result, but if you compare what they got on the provincial ballot a few weeks ago, fascinatingly enough, they were able to claw back some support. Now, they will hope that MK will be a one-election wonder and that there is a path to growth. But the IFP were certainly far bigger winners in KwaZulu-Natal and the DA, because they won that ward in Newcastle, than the ANC.
Okay, so Wayne, all in all, right, what are we seeing here? Because we're having difficulties in establishing a government of national unity. One could say those by-elections happened under the understanding that, sanity's prevailed and the two biggest parties have got together to work for the benefit of the country. And perhaps that might have influenced the outcome of those by-elections. Perhaps, I'm saying. But subsequently, we've seen spats and arguments in just the formation of the cabinet. Do you see these things as, do you think those parties that did well in that round of by-elections might get punished by this confusion that's going on in government at the moment?
Here, with by-elections, you can get a good card. So you can get wards where you have a chance of winning. But of course, you still have to win those wards. When the IFP showed up and did it, and the DA showed up and did it. But I also think there might be this post-election glow, this honeymoon period. That does not last forever. And just, look, I just want to tell people that it's very... In Europe and in other parts of the world, this takes months to negotiate coalitions. These are complicated. We are in a scenario where the ANC are no longer a 58% party, but a party below 40%. We're in a scenario where the DA did grow, but they didn't grow tremendously at the expense of the ANC. Okay, they grew slightly, and that was mainly because of the Freedom Front. We're in a scenario where the ANC and the MK are far apart. The MK didn't really come to the coalition table. We're in a scenario where the EFF went backwards. We're in a scenario where the IFP had some growth. We're in a scenario where Panyaza Lesufi cannot form a Gauteng government without the DA, the MK, or the EFF. These are hard scenarios, and in a short space of time, we need to understand that the coalition negotiations at this point, which might be concluded very shortly, are going to have disagreements, are going to have not just disagreements with parties, Mike, but disagreements internally. Of course, the ANC and EC is going to be divided. Of course, the DA, federal executive or federal council is not going to be happy. So I'm not too panicked about the negotiations. I think sanity will prevail. And what we saw play out in Parliament with Steenhuisen and Ramaphosa, or Ramaphosa and Steenhuisen, will ultimately see the two largest parties come together. And if they weren't disagreeing about positions or policies or about a framework for a 5-year plan, I'd be more concerned.
Now, Wayne, I'm going to just end off by asking you, I know that you're a numbers guy, but you also watch things. I get the sense that South Africans need to get back to work. We need economic growth. We need some calm. We need some management. Do you see that going through to the politicians? I mean, do you see this idea that we need to get a little bit more serious about what we're doing in our politics?
Yeah, if we saw Fikile Mbalula's press conference at the Results Operations Centre, The Rock, if you saw the DA's press conferences after the election, even Julius Malema at The Rock, I think that political parties realize that if they don't pull up their socks, if they don't work, even if it's an opposition, to turn the fortunes around of this country in the next 5 years, voters will continue to stay away from the polls. Only 58, 59% of voters showed up on election day, well down from 66%. That's an admonishment of all political parties across the scene, and by the way, possibly the IEC as well. So yeah, if political parties are not going to govern better and do things differently this time around, voters will punish you and continue to stand away. And not enough jobs will be created, not enough economic growth will be stimulated. The stakes are higher than ever, Mike.
Okay, and then I'm just going to close off with something that possibly we should have started off with, and that is that you were close to the numbers. You were hanging around the rock, the results center. Do you think there's any credence to any election malfeasance at all?
No, I don't think. Look, we do see mistakes being made. Okay, so how does a mistake get made? People are tired. It takes time to count the votes. We had to count a third ballot. Once that result slip gets signed and it gets handed to the IEC number cruncher can make a mistake. How do I mean? So on the provincial ballot, the ANC gets 500 votes at the Mike Sham Community Centre in the Eastern Cape. But then on the regional ballot, they get 0 votes. That's highly impossible. And those votes go to the AMC party or some other party above. So those need to be sorted out. I do not think there was fraud. I do not think there was stuffing of ballot boxes. I think this election is largely free and fair. There are a lot of lessons to be learned for the IEC. The fact that some voting stations were run efficiently, but some others, you had obstinate people running the voting stations who didn't want to adapt what they were doing, which meant people were queuing for hours. And I mean by hours, I mean places in the suburbs, places in townships, places in formal settlements. That's not on. Elections must be fair to voters queuing as well. But I think the elections are free and fair. And I mean, Mike, the ANC declined by 18 percentage points. The MK came out of nowhere to 3rd place. If you just look at the results, I mean, the ANC weren't throwing their toys out of the cot.
Yeah. And I suppose to use my reading of the situation is that I know this is hardly a sort of Northern European take on this, but I suppose the elections were free and fair enough for this result to be without question. Just one point of notification: the Mike Sham Community Centre in the Eastern Cape is being turned into a casino. So, perhaps we'll vote differently the next time. Wayne Sussman, it's always a pleasure to have you here to unpack these things. As these by-elections unfold, we're going to get Wayne back again. I know everybody's been clamoring to hear from Wayne. To everybody that joined us, go and vote for Pace Car Rental the next time you need a car. Vote for the State of the Nation by subscribing and liking the channel. And we'll keep the information coming. Wayne Sussman, thank you once again. And we'll see you all again on the State of the Nation.